On Canon EOS R cameras, most customizable button functions are configured through either the button customization or customized buttons for shooting menus. However, there is one exception to this. In movie record mode or movie mode, the shutter release has a completely separate entry in the menus that is used to configure its half and full press functionality. Customizing the shutter buttons function isn't actually new to the R5 Mark II. In fact, it's a feature that's been found on all EOS R hybrid cameras and actually many of the late model DSLRs that also included video shooting. Now that said, an EOS R5 Mark II was used for this video to show the menus and demos that you see. If you use a different model EOS R camera, your camera's menus may be slightly different from what is shown. In that case, you'll need to refer to your camera's manual, or better yet, cam.start.canon in your web browser for the most up-to-date information for your camera. Now, unlike other button functions, customizing the shutter button in movie mode is done through the Shutter Button Functions for Movies setting. You'll find these settings on either page 1 of the green Customized Control menu section in cameras that have that, or in the red Shooting section on cameras that don't have the green Customized Control section. For example, on an R5, it's found on page 7 of the red Movie Mode Shooting menu. Now in this menu, you will find two settings, one for the half press and one for the full press functionality. By default, these are set to meter plus movie servo AF and no function, respectively. Now the half press button functions can be set to one of three settings: meter plus movie servo, meter plus one shot AF, and metering only. The full press function can be either set to no function or start-stop movie recording. Now, while these functions in essence are pretty straightforward in terms of what they do, I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about how to apply them. However, before I go any further, I want to make a quick note or reminder about how the shutter button works on Canon cameras. The half and full press functions are not exclusive to each other. When you fully press the shutter, the camera sees both the half and full press functions being triggered. Because of this, you'll want to consider how you set the half and full press functions if you're going to change them, so that you don't accidentally do something you don't want to do, like prematurely ending a video recording while you're trying to half press the shutter button to focus, but you got a little too excited. So with that in mind, let's start with the shutter full press function, since it's the simplest in terms of options. By default, the shutter full press is disabled or set to no function in movie mode, and all recordings have to be started by pressing the movie record button on the top and a little bit further back on the camera. Now, while this is not a horrible configuration, I also kind of do find it to be a little bit of a waste of perfectly good buttons to some extent as well. Now, with that said, there are certainly pros and cons to using the shutter release to start and stop recording. On the plus side, since the shutter release is physically wired in parallel to the N3 remote terminal port, that's the one in the front of the camera that you plug your shutter release or cable release into, by enabling recording on the shutter release, you can use a standard remote release to start and stop recording. In fact, if you want to use traditional radio triggers like these pocket wizards to start and stop your cameras, if you have multiple cameras set up and you're working as a solo operator, you will need to enable this setting to do that. Now, additionally, if you work with the R5C, C50, or actually any other Cinema EOS camera, they all use the shutter release by default to start and stop recording. The movie record button on those cameras, well, it's actually just button 10 on the R5C, is not actually used for recording. So if you have that kind of situation where you work on both platforms, setting your shutter on your hybrid EOS R cameras to do movie recording or start and stop recording is going to provide you with an increased level of consistency across the two platforms, which I think is always a good thing from a usability perspective. Now, on the downside, using the shutter to start and stop recordings can result in, well, accidental recordings, or worse, prematurely ending a recording if you also use the half press function for focusing. Since that was the default that Canon with on the EOS R cameras, it's very likely that that's why Canon chose to not enable starting and stopping on the full press function the way they did. Now, with the full press function out of the way, let's talk about the half press functions. Ultimately, these come down to a choice in focusing modes or just not focusing at all. There are three differences between one shot and movie servo AF, and those are your two focusing options that you can have on the button. First, and the most obvious one, is that one shot stops focusing after focus is achieved, while movie servo is, well, a servo focusing mode, and will continue to focus on a subject as long as it's active. The final movie servo AF setting, or the final difference between these two settings, is that movie servo AF focuses at the speed that is defined in the movie servo AF speed menu entry. One-shot AF is not affected by this at all and will focus much faster than movie servo AF does, which can be beneficial in some situations and can be a negative in terms of the video quality in others. Now, one interesting difference that I did discover in looking at all of this between regular movie servo, the thing that runs all the time, and movie servo AF on the shutter half press function is that movie servo AF on the shutter half press function doesn't respect or care about the subject detect AF setting found under movie servo AF in the menus. If that is on or in detect only mode, and you focus with the shutter half press in movie servo, the camera will still focus on whatever, even if it is not a detected subject. So with that all in mind, ultimately, I think there are three configurations that are worth talking about in how to set this up. The first is having the shutter half press setting set to metering and the full press setting set to start-stop recording. In a studio environment, or really any kind of situation where you don't have frantic action going on, this setup works well. This is also the configuration you want to choose if you want to use, or if you also use Cinema EOS cameras and want to mirror their shutter buttons function, as that's how their shutter buttons work. Additionally, this is how my R5 and R5 Mark II are both set up. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it that way or that you need to follow my lead, but I have done this because I shoot with an R5C, and having them all use the same start and stop recording button is great. But even beyond that, I have found that I have never run into a situation shooting the kind of content that I do, which is not really fast action, that this setup works really well for me and the way I shoot. Now, the second configuration is to turn off the full press function, set it back to no action, and then use the half press to trigger the camera's autofocus system. I would argue that this is a better configuration for shooting fast-paced things like sports while using the camera's grip and shutter to control how you're shooting things. Now, with that in mind, you can go one of two ways with this, and I don't really have a good idea or preference on which way is better. One is to turn off movie servo in the menus and have the half press function set to run movie servo AF. In this configuration, the camera will always hold focus where it was as long as you aren't holding the shutter release. However, when you want to either refocus or track someone, all you have to do is hold the shutter release down and the camera is going to go into movie servo tracking and track that subject. Now, that said, pressing the shutter release can induce some camera-related shake, and in a handheld situation, well, this kind of shake or motion is not likely to be noticeable, but in a locked-off situation on sticks, well, this motion could be a bit more problematic. Now, that said, since this is the half press only kind of thing, you can be very gentle when activating the autofocus system, or since you can use the remote release port, you could use a remote release to completely isolate the camera so there won't be any camera movement at all when you're holding the shutter button down halfway. Now, the other option that I would consider is to use one shot for the half press shutter functionality. On one hand, using this operation or configuration gives you options for using movie servo AF. More importantly, since one-shot AF doesn't have a limitation on speed, it focuses as fast as the camera can focus, half pressing the shutter release will quickly snap whatever is in focus, or whatever is under the autofocus point, I should say, into focus. Now, one application where I could see this would be really useful is combining movie servo with like a +2 tracking speed while shooting action. Since movie servo isn't always going to be able to keep up, never mind if you lose the subject and your autofocus point goes, off into wherever, focus points go when they get a little confused, you can use the camera's one-shot capabilities to quickly bring your subjects back in focus by tapping the shutter release, and then movie servo will pick up and take over again. Now, that said, since you can also program one-shot AF on a rear button, like the AF on button, choosing to go this way or with a rear button does really come down to a matter of personal preference on which way you're more comfortable using the camera. If you're a big video shooter, you might be more shutter oriented, but if you come to videos or shooting like video of action from still photography, you might be more comfortable using rear button focusing if you use that in stills. That said, when using either of these configurations, if you're working in a fast-paced environment, I would recommend setting the full press to no function so that you can't accidentally stop recording when you're in the middle of tracking great action and you over-push the button. Basically, if you can't when you're not able to carefully mash your finger, it's way too easy to smash it all the way down in a rush and potentially stop recording while you're in the middle of a really important shoot. So, that is how you customize the shutter button for movie recording functionality. Now, one thing I think that is interesting coming out of this discussion is that I'm really not sure Canon needed a half and full press function in video mode. I mean, okay, sure, there's nothing wrong with it, and it does give you options, and I'm not saying that they should take it away at this point. However, I think they could have made the shutter button perform a single function regardless, because the whole half full press situation, ideally you are going to flip things back so that one or the other is used, not necessarily both. Now, this argument that I'm making here is heavily influenced by my feeling that you either want, as I said, the shutter button to start or stop recording or activate the autofocus system, but not do both. The risk to me is that you prematurely end a recording, as I've said repeatedly, instead of activating the autofocus system, and I think that's way too much of a risk to use both of them together, especially in any kind of serious situation. It's a failure mode that leaves you stranded without necessarily being easy to recognize has happened immediately, or worse, it ruins things and you have no real recourse. The reality is, and part of the reason that I have been so vocal about this in this video, is that I have been burned by easy failure modes like this in the past with other cameras, and I'm always on the lookout for something that allows me to put myself in a situation where I can easily screw myself over by accidentally doing something that I didn't intend to do. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.